Okay, I think we probably should start.
I'm saying
Welcome,
good.
everybody. Hi, Solomon. Nice to see you.
Greetings to all. Yeah, good to see you all.
So we're delighted that we've got another one of these evenings focusing on gospel music. I'm grateful to Duncan for taking a lead on organising this, and I'm now going to hand over to Duncan, who's going to guide us through this evening.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you, everybody, for coming to the second one in our series, which I called after a gospel record, I Cannot Run This Race Alone. So we've been thinking about gospel music, and we've also been thinking about the heritage of gospel music, which goes back into the days of slavery in the southern United States, because a lot of Black American gospel music has its roots from that period. We're going to be listening to a song which was written in the early part of the 19th century, but it's been updated to connect with contemporary events. And we'll come to that in a minute. But for those of you who haven't met Udoka Meyer, I'd like to introduce you. Udoka worships with us at Bloomsbury as often as she can. Thank you, Udoka, for coming along and suggesting tonight's song. Would you I think everybody knows you're just at the end of your anthropology course at University of London. Is that right? You're in your third year there, am I right?
Yeah, fourth year. But
fourth year.
Yeah, so last year, well, this past academic year, I was in Italy, which was great come March. But yeah, I've been at Bloomsbury since I was a fresher. So, yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you found Bloomsbury, and thank you for connecting us with this particular song, which fits in really well with the themes that we've been looking at. So what we'll do is I'll start by saying something about the context of this music. Then we'll look together at the lyrics and we'll hear the first version of the song. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion about some of the Bible elements that come from the song. And then we'll move on to watching another version of the song, which draws out some of the political symbolism. So the song's called Hold On, and we don't know who wrote it. Probably it didn't have one single writer, but we do know that the period it came from was probably between 1780 and 1840 in its original versions, during the time of slavery in the southern United States. And a lot of the lyrics draw from stories in the Bible, which was typical of spirituals from this period. And one of the things that I'm learning from studying the songs for this series is that although on outward superficial appearances, the religion of the slaves seems quite similar to their white masters, I think, in fact, it's very radically different. So songs like Hold On use the language of the Bible to challenge the oppressors. 2 weeks ago, when the Reverend Stephen Hance was discussing this, he talked about how coded language was used to act as a kind of surreptitious way of criticizing the slavery system and the hypocrisy of the white masters. And I found a quote from a judge in Alabama at this period. He said that slaves should be taught Christianity because it increased their value as honest and faithful servants and laborers. And I was very struck when I read that by the phrase, it increased their value. Because, of course, nowadays, when we think about values, we talk about virtue, whether or not somebody is living in accordance with their values. Are they following a certain moral code? But in the time of slavery, value meant how much a slave cost at auction. They weren't people, they were property. So their religion and their songs were wrought from this traumatic experience. And I hear in nearly all the songs a passionate yearning to be free. To put it bluntly, if black lives didn't matter to the white people, the songs said that their lives did matter very much indeed to God and to Jesus. And as I listen to the spirituals, I hear them as a way of affirming the dignity of the singers. And in contrast to that white judge, a black preacher from this period said to his congregation, he said, "You are created in God's image. You're not slaves." He used a word then, which as now was used as an offensive racial slur. He said, "That's not who you are. You're God's children." And I think the other thing before we consider the biblical references is to consider one key theology concept here, and that is God is community. God is the community. These types of songs in general don't ponder about whether God cares about the lives of slaves or black people or their families. In other spirituals, we hear that God is a mother to the motherless, a father to the fatherless, an ever-present hope in the time of trouble. The problem is not that God doesn't care. The concern that comes up in these songs repeated over and over again is whether the pain and the sadness of this world, the cruelty of other human beings, will cause the community to lose faith. So tonight's song is a call to solidarity, an urgent message, just as it was then, to hold on to the faith and to hold on to the faith together. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Simon to put the words to the song onto the screen. Thank you, Yuka, for making this pretty slide. And Udoka, would you like to just read out the lyrics to us before we listen to the performance, please?
Noah, Noah, let me come in. Doors all fastened and the windows pinned. Keep your hand on that plough, hold on. Noah said, you done lost your track. Can't plough straight and keep looking back. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. Mary had a golden chain, every link spelt with Jesus' name. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. All that chain had never been tied. Every round goes higher and higher. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on. If you want to get to heaven, now I'll tell you how. Keep your hand on the gospel plough. Keep your hand on that plough, just hold on. All that chain had never tied. Every round goes higher and higher. Keep your hand on that plough and hold on.
Thank you, Udoka, for reading that beautifully. Simon, would you like to put the words into the chat in case anybody wants to have a look at them again in a moment? And we'll now watch the first performance of this, thanks to YouTube. A hard act to follow, isn't it? So the lyrics there are the oldest version of the song that I could find. And of course, we don't have an explanation from the songwriter as to how he or she reached that particular set of words. And as I say, I think it was probably a collaborative effort anyway. But I'll say a couple of things about it. It obviously has a number of biblical references. And right at the start, the Old Testament and the New Testament run together. That's typical of spirituals. We had that with "Oh Mary, Don't You Weep," which we looked at 2 weeks ago, where the story of the resurrection of Lazarus and the deliverance of the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt were meshed together in the same song. Here we've got the story of Noah's Ark and some words of Christ that come together. They say in the first verse that Noah said, "Keep your hand on the plough, don't look back." In fact, those are the words of Christ. The context here is that it was illegal to teach slaves to read. So when they heard the Bible, they were remembering the stories and the words that came to them in meetings. It wasn't something that they read, and they therefore wouldn't have had the sort of chronology that we have of Bible stories. Everything happened simultaneously. And the stories that stayed with them were the ones that felt relevant to their own particular traumatic experience. With that in mind, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Simon to explain something about this message from Noah stroke Jesus about keeping one's hand on the plough.
Sure, thanks, Duncan. I will be quite brief. The quotation which we've heard, it's from Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 62, or verse 61. No one who puts their hands to the plough and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So I'm just going to, for about 2 or 3 minutes, give you a bit of context for this. So this is presented by Luke as part of a passage which is a short collection of sayings. And broadly, they emphasize the necessity of complete commitment on the part of Jesus' followers. They can be heard, I think, as very harsh. So verse 57 of Luke chapter 9, just a few verses earlier, someone says they want to follow Jesus. And Jesus follows up in verse 58 by saying, making it very clear that following him is an uncertain and difficult journey. And he says that the famous quote, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Because the person has said they will follow him anywhere. And he says, well, where you will follow me is somewhere that you have nowhere to lay your head. Then in verse 59, somebody says, I'd love to follow you, but first I want to bury my father, which sounds very reasonable. But then in verse 60, the next verse, Jesus takes it somewhere slightly different. There is possibly an implication here that the man's father isn't even dead yet and that he's seeking a slightly longer delay than would take to organize a quick funeral. But Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead, which might be interpreted as let those who are spiritually dead bury the dead. Those who are spiritually alive have other more important priorities. And then after those two, you've got the person who wants to follow Jesus and the foxes have holes, birds that have nests response. And then you've got the I want to bury my father and Jesus saying let the dead bury their own dead. We then in verse 61 get to the question that gives rise to the verse that's quoted in our song for this evening. And actually it's a reference to an Old Testament story, which is the story of the call of Elisha to become Elijah's protege. So in 1 Kings 19, I'm sure you can all remember it, Elijah is walking along and he sees Elisha ploughing a field with some oxen. And Elijah symbolically throws his mantle over Elisha. You know the phrase passing on the mantle? It comes from here, the mantle of succession. But Elisha responds by asking permission from Elijah for him to go first and bid farewell to his parents. Elijah, in turn, instead turns him back and tells him not to follow him at all. In the end, Elisha sacrifices his entire herd of oxen, putting an end to his career as a ploughman once and for all, and sets out after Elijah to become his servant. And this story from 1 Kings is the background to Jesus' saying in Luke's Gospel. So the person called by Jesus asks permission to go and say farewell to his family. And Jesus responds, no one who puts their hands to the plough and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So this is another further clear reference to the ploughing in the Elijah-Elisha story. Jesus, it seems, is looking for those who will follow him with unhesitating devotion. And before we get too hung up on the judgmental tone that could be read into Jesus' response, we do need to remember that Elisha does indeed end up as Elijah's protege. All is not lost for the would-be follower of Jesus, just because they want to go and bid farewell to their family. But they do need to realize that if they're going to be a disciple, they will have to learn that this is a discipleship that demands everything. So that's just an insight into the Bible verse that is then quoted in the song. And the Bible verse is itself quoting the Old Testament. Okay, I'll stop now.
Thank you. I wonder whether anybody else wants to come in to talk about what they saw as the connection between the different Bible stories and that mysterious reference to Mary's golden chain.
certainly I noticed the reference to chains, and obviously chains were something every slave had to endure, sometimes all day long, certainly when they were at auction. And it just made me think, you know, chains bind things together, and it's binding the slave through his chains to Mary, with every link in the chain referencing Jesus. So I can see the imagery that would be there with that and with that connection.
I wondered if it might be something like a rosary. Sorry.
There are lots of chains on ploughs, and sometimes it's a solid arm going back towards the plough from the collar. Other times it's a chain going back from the collar that the oxen would have worn, and then the yoke would have been fastened to the collar, and then most likely a chain went back from that to the plough.
That's intriguing. I didn't know that. And as you say, Simon, I had thought about this idea about a rosary, a system of beads which is used for prayers, particularly in Roman Catholic churches. I wonder whether that was something that the slaves had encountered in the religious lives of the white masters. It's a bit of a mystery, that, I have to say.
No.
I think also like the image of devotion, maybe, like, and Mary, the figure of like a mother having lost a child, would be very familiar to a lot of slaves at that time, maybe.
And what do you need to do to get to heaven? It's a good question to ask a minister, but can I just have a look at the lyrics there on the, if you want to get to heaven, you have to do something specific, don't you? I'll tell you how. You've got to keep your hand on the gospel plough to get to heaven. Well, I'm always quite intrigued by the way heaven makes quite a lot of appearances in these black slave spirituals and in gospel music later. I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I think we enter heaven as a community with our heads held high. It's a proud achievement where our humanity and our community is fully recognized. That's the way I see the symbolism of heaven in these types of songs. I don't think this is where I think the ideas have become subverted, because I imagine that some of the slave masters and their ministers try to say to the slaves, you be good or you won't get to heaven where you'll get your eternal reward. But I've got a feeling that the symbolism became subverted to mean something about aspiring to freedom and dignity in this life. But I am speculating.
If you want to keep your plough straight, you have to keep your hand on it. And it's quite important that it's straight, otherwise it doesn't turn the earth properly. So it can have that sort of interpretation as well.
Shall we move on to the second version of the song, which was recorded? Well, Udoka, do you want to introduce this is your choice. Do you want to introduce the context in which this very recent update of the song was made?
So this is the Isaac Cates version, and it was recorded in 2017 during one of the early iterations of the Black Lives Matter marches and protests. And during the video, you can see lots of footage from protests as well as other kind of events and situations in life overlaid over the choir singing.
Thank you. It's a very powerful performance. Udoka, how did you feel when you were watching it again just now?
I think it's definitely very powerful, very moving. I think the lyrical changes, which we can discuss a little bit more later, were very interesting as well, the lyrical differences. But I definitely remember from, probably in high school when I heard about Trayvon Martin's death, and on and on. And when every year, every couple of months, whenever another Black person would be a victim of police brutality, you're kind of, apart from being confronted with like your own precariousness, you just feel a deep sense of despair and a deep sense of injustice, but also like a need for the comfort. So the addition of the line, everything will be all right, even though to some it might seem kind of trite and quite sentimental, it's such an essential sentiment when you are faced again and again and again for God knows how long. I can't imagine how my mother would feel, for example, having seen and experienced like a lot of racism, seeing the same images repeating. It kind of reinforces the importance of this music and understanding the Afro-American struggle, the struggle more globally, I think.
Yeah, I noticed that at one point at the end, somebody saying joy will come in the morning. Hold on, just a little bit.
Sorry to interrupt, Duncan. Is anybody else having trouble hearing Duncan at this precise moment?
Yes.
Just me. Yeah, Duncan, you sound like you're a Dalek. Something's gone wrong.
Yes.
Sorry, is that clearer?
Much better.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you had to
Thank you for telling me. Good. Yeah, Udoka, I noticed that the one of the singers sings "Joy will come in the morning." Hold on, just a little bit longer. What is the event that is being anticipated, do you think?
I think so. There's like on multiple levels. Like the most direct, maybe the most obvious, is the idea of like heaven and liberation. A lot of Black churches, especially those in the more evangelical tradition, believe in, you know, the coming return of Jesus, and with that, all the good and glory of that. Apart from like the kind of heaven and celestial kind of implication, you have the idea of like endurance in anticipation of eventual freedom, and the hope of tomorrow, the hope of people who, as one of the clips showed, like do intervene and do try and stand up for justice, is that in the future that will come. So I think.
And I'm struck that we've been talking about Americans here. We've talked about the Black slaves in America. We've talked about the gospel music golden era of the mid-20th century, and we've watched, you know, 2 videos made by Americans. As somebody living in London, how do you relate to this American music? Do you feel a strong connection to it because it's made by Black people, or does it feel a foreign music? Tell me how you feel about that.
So I specifically kind of grew up in just outside London, in Luton, in a tradition that was very, I think first of all, kind of have to talk about positionality. So I would say that in terms of racial politics and like the racial discussion with regards to like Black British people in the UK, we are at least 10, 15 years behind America in terms of our reckoning with like the effects of institutional racism. And when you can see the quality of the discourse in America, there's first a kind of sense of like people not being willing to admit that racism is something that exists and, you know, is present in this country. Nevertheless, a lot of Black British people do experience racism. So you have a sense of, like people relate to it because a lot of it mirrors experience. It's not exactly because the American context is specific. And obviously like the holdover from Jim Crow laws changes things a lot. But definitely, in fact, many people who've been Black in the UK for the past 50 years will say that some things have changed significantly and some things haven't. My exposure to this kind of gospel music, most of what I would listen to was far more up-tempo, but it occurred in church. It was like a kind of African and Afro-American fusion. So we'd be listening to Kirk Franklin and people like Sinach. And it felt very natural to us, maybe because a lot of Africans are looking towards the Americas to shape their own gospel music and gospel sound, and to some extent, maybe further back in the 20th century, vice versa, never felt that foreign or that unfamiliar. But it definitely seemed cooler than us because they had bigger churches, bigger budgets, like the very stereotypical, almost like Sister Act view of like all this like row of like smiling Afro-Americans in purple robes. A lot of our churches were far more on the margins, or are far more on the margins, because they're set up within immigrant communities. Black people in the US are 13% of the population. Here we're 3% of the population. So the Black church, as it is, it doesn't really exist in the same way, but there are a lot of kind of echoes and resonances.
Really interesting. I'd like to open it up to the group to hear other people's responses to particularly the second version of Hold On. How did people feel watching that?
I felt it was emotional and political, whereas the earlier one was much more biblical and measured, but they were in an era where they were being even more roughly treated than the guys today. So it's something to do with the way our whole society, I think, is moving towards a more emotive-based approach to life.
Well, I certainly concur with you that there's a political element to the second one. Is there a place in religious songwriting for that kind of political messaging?
I don't have a problem with it, but it was more emotional than political. If we all get worked up enough, we'll win, rather than let's present a decent case.
Solomon.
Yes, if I may come in, my interpretation of black gospel and black preaching is you try to understand the level of faith. What a faith is something that is measured or not, because the way black gospel and black preaching express themselves, it's like the present of some sort of inner emotion that is expressed, like none other, and through singing, and then the history of slavery and the expression of it, and the preaching of it, and the interpretation of it. It's just creates a sense that you try to measure the faith. So the faith is like so deep. It is not a dull faith or an if faith. It's something that is strongly grounded to say, oh, yes, even though I'm going through this, but I am going to hold on. I'm going to hold on for that change to come. And it is, in my understanding, very exclusive. And the interpretation of it, that's what, for me, is fascinating. And some people express their faith in a very cold manner, but with black gospel and black preaching, you see that outpouring of emotion very deeply, and the faith has no description in it. It's just, it's faith for what it is, and there's no measurement in it.
That's really interesting. So do you think that we have the right emotional tone when we worship in Bloomsbury together, when we sing together? Are we sufficiently in touch with the emotional aspects of faith?
That's a good question, because I wouldn't put myself in a position to measure a faith of an individual, faith of a church, because faith is expressed in different factions, right? And it is true that individually we will say to ourselves that, okay, if this happened, I'm going to believe. Though this happened to me, I'm going to believe. So those kind of interpretation and expression of it varies in different places. So to put myself in a position where I will interpret individual faith or a faith of a church, that is very difficult. But what I see or experience with black gospel and black preaching it is deeply expressed, and the outpouring of emotion is immense. So, in terms of Bloomsbury, there are people who have the faith very silently. Personally, I keep my faith very silently as an individual because of my character, and similarly to other people. But faith is something that I don't know if Simon can help on this, but we tend to measure faith in different categories. And if somebody is believing, say, oh, if this happened to me, I'm going to believe more, or though this happened to me, I'm going to still believe. So it's difficult to interpret, but that remains an open question. But I think the faith is based on the individual, how he expresses. But this situation is peculiar because we are dealing with people that have a long history and experience of something that changed humanity for me, I see forever, the condition of slavery. So outpouring of emotion, expression, it's just fascinating. It's immense to me.
Thank you, Solomon. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think also these are particularly emotional rediscoveries of these songs because they're a way of finding a response in music to things that are difficult to express in words, aren't they? I mean, what can you say to slavery or racism or Trump? What more can you say? Julian?
Yeah, maybe I'd just make a few comments. I think the music is so fantastic that it will cross any kind of border, national border, racial border, any other kind of border of the mind. I think on the text, it's quite difficult to pin things down. I know the version that you had there kicks off with Noah, as many of these versions do. But the one I'm most familiar with is that of the person who was made the soloist at First Baptist Church in Chicago because her voice was too big to sing in the choir, Mahalia Jackson. And she's got some very different lyrics. When my way gets dark, I know the Lord will be my light. When I get to heaven, I think this is a really nice verse of hers. When I get to heaven, gonna sing and shout, be nobody there to put me out. And I think a couple of other points I'd make is, first of all, the agricultural background. And last time I thought that was such a classic song to be picking cotton in those hot fields in the south. This one with that plow rhythm is just incredible. B.B. King, the great blues guitarist who sadly is no longer with us, he said he lived to a ripe old age because he spent so many years walking behind the plow. And a number of gospel and blues singers come from Dockeray Farm, which famously taught all sorts of people, and may even have had an enlightened farmer. But another farm in that part of the world is Parchment. And I think there's a key here to Parchment Farm, which is the prison, where there was a plantation environment, and that rings very clearly with the chain issue that pops up in a number of these versions. Mary wore 3 links of chain. Pete Seeger sang famously that every link is freedom's name. And I was born in Africa and grew up there, and I can remember seeing chain gangs working on the roads and people getting sent to Parchment, or the Louisiana version, which is called Angola. Interestingly, I hear a lot of sort of Africa in some of the melodies and rhythms here, but that farming issue and the chain gang prisoners sent down for pathetic little offences then leads to what you've been talking about, which is the appalling racism and injustice, which is still going to be dealt with. I went as 3 summers working as an undergraduate in the States, and then I went back as a student in the United States. And I can remember the first time I went to Atlanta, Georgia, obviously on the track of Ebenezer Baptist Chapel and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., there were segregated toilets in downtown Atlanta. Now, some of that has disappeared, but there are an awful lot of other problems of racism in the United States. And look, we don't need to look very far from Britain, do we, to know that there is appalling discrimination in Britain, and many people coming from challenged backgrounds have a raw deal. So I think these gospel songs, although they may come from a historical period of slavery, the music is fabulous, the text is really interesting, but they also speak to our condition now in Britain and elsewhere.
Thank you, Julian. That's some really good insights there.
Yeah.
You mentioned there about the beginning of this song starting with Noah. We did talk about this a couple of weeks ago, but there are often references here to people who were saved or liberated in the Old Testament in these spirituals. Daniel, and of course the Exodus story are hugely important. Noah was saved by God. Although I reread the story of Noah from Genesis chapter 9, I think, in preparation for today, and it ends with some extraordinary remarks about people being punished by slavery. I'm not going to go through that now because I don't really understand it, but after Noah has been saved, the next generation is cursed with slavery in a rather mysterious and shocking way. So I guess one of the reasons these Old Testament stories had a connection to people was because they mentioned that God was on the side of the slaves at a time when the white masters were pretending that God was on their side.
The chieftain masters, they weren't all white ones who were being nasty to slaves.
It's a very complex history of slavery in the US. I think that there were some cases of Native Americans, but it was very, very much mostly, especially for the kind of heyday of slavery when it really got going, mostly white landowners, men and women. There was a recent book released that actually really went dug deep into the histories, because there's this really because of how politicized everything is in the US, even history and simple historical facts is politicized. So sometimes certain documents are hidden away. But the huge role of white women in perpetuating the slave trade and owning slaves was kind of delved into. But you're quite right in that it's not only, but I'd say that mostly it was white slave owners, just because of the kind of capital that you needed to own slaves at the time. It was quite difficult for people who weren't considered white to have access to. If that makes sense.
I'm interested to know about your experience of worshipping in church, in your family's church, in your mother's church, and then how that is different to Bloomsbury. Can you explain a little bit about what a Sunday feels like when you're with your family and what a Sunday feels like when you're with us?
I mean, in a usual non-COVID time, church at home is a far longer affair. So as the pastor's kid, or the PK as we're known.
PK.
There's lots of PK memes you could find on the internet, which are quite funny. But we'd get there at 8:30 and we'd leave, if we were lucky, by 3 p.m. So just in terms of like the temporality, it's very different. But I think like African Pentecostalism and the Bloomsbury kind of baptism, like Baptist churches, like what I think connects the two experiences is an emphasis on kind of like social justice and reaching out. So both Bloomsbury and Gloria Fire Ministries, which is my mother's church, are very like outward looking communities. So they do that in very different ways. And I think that my mother's church, like growing up and in the churches similar to it before my mother founded her church, there was a lot of emphasis on kind of like doing work like food bank work and like making sure that people, not just the people that seem upstanding and like the typical Christians, but people who maybe were struggling with dealing with social services or dealing with like immigration enforcement and trying to like secure their future in the country. People who maybe what wouldn't have necessarily been you'd expect to see going to like a Black church, felt comfortable regardless. I was having a conversation with my mum about one lady who, to be honest, to me, when I first encountered her, seemed like the worst possible stereotype of a Little Englander. I was very surprised when I came back from a uni break and I saw her at church at all, because she was quite acidic in her approach to like immigration and certain other issues, quite small C conservative, and she's just sat in the middle of the congregation surrounded by almost exclusively by these like Black Africans, all of which were like migrants, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then I realized that it felt like it was actually very important for her to be there, because it helped her to kind of like get an understanding of different worldviews and different experiences. I think the main difference and the difference that's most pertinent to this discussion is the music. And so my brother kind of like used to play drums for the church choir. The church choir was usually 4 to 5 people, none of whom were like necessarily musically trained, though the choir master, the pianist, was. And it flows differently. I think Solomon kind of alluded to it. Yes, it's more emotional directly, though I think, again, as Solomon said, it's hard to like measure emotionality and measure engagement in that way. Outwardly, yes, and more exuberant, but people kind of like feel very comfortable jumping in and falling in and harmonizing. I'm not a great singer at all, but I feel comfortable doing that because it's the kind of environment I grew up in. And it's not necessarily like both of these performances are rather mannered. There's dancing, it's loud, there's singing, someone will like walk past and pick up a tambourine and start shaking it. It's very exuberant, but there's also space for quietude and space for just like letting the worship wash over you. And that's when you'll see people crying in the pews, and just, the emotional nature of it isn't necessarily people trying to be manipulative or people trying to like make an emotional argument it's just the natural excess that comes from living in a world that can be a very harsh place sometimes. And I think that the Pete Seeger version of this song that you spoke about, Julian, is a really good example, because I think what these different versions speak to is that there is an inherent violence, not only in American society, but in a lot of our societies. During the Isaac Cates version of the song, you had like images of people who were, in hospital beds, not necessarily on protests or anything. And many of those people would be forced to pay exorbitant hospital bills just for being unfortunate enough to fall ill. And this music kind of, I don't know, I'll stop talking about it, but like it kind of falls within a sense of like, all of us are forced to endure situations that shouldn't really be happening in societies if they were kind of like embracing a more Christ-like ethic of like looking after people regardless of their ability, and more to do with like meeting people's material needs. But that's just, sorry, I've spoken a lot.
No, don't apologise. You've brought a lot of very interesting insights there, actually, in a short space of time. Thank you. Is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to express themselves so far that would like to say how they felt about the songs, or this type of worship? I'm aware there's a few people in the meeting who haven't said anything yet.
I'm afraid I missed the songs. I came in too late, so I just heard the discussion about them.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we've covered a lot of ground there. The songs are very moving, and they're the roots of all kinds of wonderful music that came afterwards. We have two more speakers or guests, I should say, booked to discuss gospel music with us. In 2 weeks' time, Naveen, who is the musical director of the London International Gospel Choir, is going to join us. I think his own personal story about his spiritual journey is intriguing anyway. And I'm also particularly interested to talk to him about how a choir that is made up of people of a variety of different backgrounds and faiths, including people who I don't think would see themselves as religious in any way, come together to sing gospel music and inspirational music. I'm really interested to know how that feels in London. And then in January, the Reverend Travis Adams, who did his sort of training, pastoral training at Bloomsbury a couple of years ago, but is now a pastor in Illinois in the United States, is going to join us. Travis is a really lively, fun character, and also a very good singer and musician. So I'm really going to recommend that if you possibly can join us for the discussion with Travis in January, do stay with us. And in the meantime, if you want any recommendations as to good music to listen to in this genre, do get in touch with Adoka and I. We've got long lists of songs and singers and choirs that we can recommend to you. Thank you. Simon.
Hi, just to say thank you once again to Udoka. It was a fascinating exploration of the song, and I learned a lot. I think something that just really struck me was it's not just about musical style or openness to express emotion. It's about the story that leads to the moment of worship and what you bring with you into worship and how that affects the moment of worship. I need to kind of ponder that, because I guess in the past I thought it was, well, you know, some people like this, some people like that, I like this. I think there's a lot more complexity to this than that, and I've just begun to get some insight into that this evening, so thank you so much. And Duncan, once again, thank you for organising this series. And it's 8:30, so we're going to finish on time. Everybody, thank you for coming. See you in a couple of weeks, and I'll see many of you before then.